Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. My name is Suliman Ravat. In recent days, Syria has started to make the headlines again. We hear about the fall of Aleppo. Many were taken aback. What's happening? In the last year and a bit, most of the focus when it comes to the Muslim world, most of the focus when it comes to international issues has been on the situation in Palestine and the genocide being perpetrated there against the people of Gaza. Now, Syria is back in the limelight. It's time to refresh our memories in terms of what has happened in the last decade and a bit in Syria, try and understand what has happened in recent days, why it's happening, and what's likely to happen in the short to medium term going forward. Our guest, Professor Hennie Strydom, Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, a very good day to you and welcome to Debunked here on INX Prime.
Thank you and good afternoon and to your viewers.
So let me start off by asking you to do a brief synopsis for our viewers. What has happened in the last 14 years? What led to the Syria 14-year civil war?
Well, we have to recall the Arab Spring. It's part of that whole movement across many countries in the Middle East and close to it, where you had opposition forces being dissatisfied with oppressive regimes and trying to change the political situation inside those countries. And that's exactly how the conflict started in 2011 in Syria, where the opposition forces wanted to get rid of the Assad family and the oppressive regime that has become, over many years, associated with the Assad family.
So in recent years, right, from around 2020 when COVID struck, the war kind of went static, perhaps because of the Russia and Turkey peace agreement. What has led up to this? What has led to the recent flare-up, in your opinion?
I think the opposition forces, they were still sort of active, but it was a low-intensity conflict that was ongoing, even in very recent times. And I think they have made this sort of, or taken a calculated risk, taking note of the position that Russia is in at the moment with the Ukraine war. And you must recall that Russia was one of the supporters of the Assad regime, and in many ways, militarily and otherwise. And secondly, Iran is in a difficult position, another backer of the Assad regime. So, and Iran and, of course, its proxy organization, Hezbollah, being caught up in the war in Gaza and in Lebanon. So I think with that scenario in mind, the opposition forces decided, well, perhaps this is now the opportune moment to attack again. And they have been successful, at least in part, in taking control of Aleppo.
So before we talk about Aleppo, let's just remind our viewers, because like I say, it's gone static in the last couple of years and it's got a 14-year context. What is it, or what was in it for both Russia and Iran? Why were they propping up the Assad regime? Why did they support the Assad regime after this kind of internal rebellion, if you like, flowing from the Arab Spring, as you've just explained?
There were sort of political reasons because of the situation that was developing in Syria. And you must recall that both in Russia and in Iran, we sit with authoritarian governments who also face internal dissatisfaction. And I think it's because of that, but not only because of that, that they decided to support the Assad regime. Trying to prevent chaos from developing there, and which may spread to their countries as well. But there were also economic ties, oil and all of that, and other sort of trade relations that made it, I think, for Russia to intervene in this regard. And there may also be another reason because of the fact that the USA was supporting the opposition forces in Syria at the time, and is probably still doing so. So those are the sort of geopolitical contexts within which we have to assess the involvement of Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, the United States, Israel, and also Turkey.
We know, Prof, that civil war has a catastrophic impact, not only on the people, but even on the infrastructure of a country. In the last 4 years, when things kind of went static, what was it like within Damascus in particular and Syria in general? Was there some degree of rebuilding going on before these recent happenings?
Yes, certainly. There was quite extensive activities going on to rebuild the cities destroyed in the civil war. But of course, the sort of nature and scope of the destruction was vast, and it would have taken quite a number of years to restore it to what these cities were before the war started. And now there's another phase of destruction going on. And if other sort of forces are going to intervene, and the rebel forces take courage of what they have achieved in the last few days, that conflict may expand and also involve other areas which have been rebuilt in the meantime, or partly rebuilt, and which may cause their further destruction once again.
So, coming to the events of recent days, what's your analysis? I mean, who's been responsible? There are various groups that we understand historically that were at play. Where did the impetus come from? Where did the funding come from? What kind of strategy was employed in order to ensure that Aleppo fell?
It's very difficult to say because at this point in time, there's no clear evidence whether this was an initiative solely from the opposition forces in taking advantage of the situation, or whether there were other sort of actors involved. Yeah, so I cannot make an assessment on that issue, and we have to see how the conflict will develop, if it is going to develop further, and what the other parties involved here, inside and outside of Syria, are going to do. That will provide us with a clearer picture of the interests that are at stake and how countries and other groups want to defend those interests.
How critical is Aleppo?
It is critical. You must understand that because of the other countries involved, external forces, and the many rebel and militia forces inside Syria, actively or inactively involved at this point in time, it creates a situation that has become very messy, and it has all the elements of a perfect storm. So if it cannot be contained, it may increase, and that may have devastating consequences, not only for Syria, but for the region as well. And I have to raise another point here. There is some reaction, I think today or yesterday, by the foreign minister of Turkey, who made a very important assessment of the situation. He says that we still have the situation, and this very potentially dangerous one, because of a failure of the Assad regime to negotiate with the opposition and to find a solution and a political settlement. So that opportunity has been missed. And as we all know, there were no successful negotiations over the last couple of years in order to find a political settlement. So the Assad regime is partly to blame, in my view as well, for this situation and making it very precarious. So at this point in time, it's a very volatile situation, and it may easily get out of hand completely.
So there is a lot of talk that the Assad regime remains highly unpopular within Damascus. Would you concur with that sentiment, firstly? And secondly, does that make Damascus itself vulnerable? Would the rebels now realistically stand a chance to take control of Damascus? Or is it that even with Russia preoccupied elsewhere and with Iran having its own issues, and then with Israel occupied with the issues that we will discuss in a bit, that the Assad regime still has enough capacity to defend Damascus?
Yeah, I think it has some capacity. Yeah, how strong that is difficult to say, because we must rely in the past. You accept that in the past it relied on Russia And Russia played a major role in propping up the regime during a difficult phase of the conflict since 2011. And it also could count on Iran and Hezbollah. So I do not think that all three of those supporting partners are in a position to provide the same kind of support and assistance as in the past. They are limited in their capacity because of the wars that they are involved in. So I do not think that the Syrian government can realistically rely on the same kind and intense support it received in the past. And that makes it more vulnerable, depending on how strong the opposition forces are and where they are getting help from and what the extent of that help could be militarily and otherwise.
So we've spoken about Russia, about Iran, about Hezbollah. What about Israel and what it's doing currently in Lebanon? Does that in any way have an impact on what has happened and could likely happen in Syria?
Certainly, because Israel is still executing attacks in Syria on Hezbollah strongholds and so on, because some of the attacks on Israel are coming from Syrian territory. So as long as that is the case, that is an element, meaning the Israeli element, still relevant and should be taken into account.
What is America's role here? I mean, we know they're kind of like in transition, right? The Biden administration is on its way out. The Trump administration is on its way in. Has there been any comments of note in as far as what's happening in Syria? In your assessment, where would this rank in the list of priorities for the incoming Trump regime?
I think the priority at this point in time for the current administration, and certainly also for Mr. Trump, is settling the issue in Gaza and Lebanon. And there's a statement by one of Trump's peculiar statements saying that there will be hell to play if the hostages that are still held by Hamas are not returned at the time when he comes to power. So that is more than a veiled threat. And it seems to me from what we have in the media is that America is very much focused on that conflict. But it may also change depending on what happens further in Syria. If there's an escalation of the conflict in Syria and other forces become more heavily involved, like Iran again and Russia, then it may also become one of the priorities for the United States to take care of.
Now, the broader regional issue, we know that it's over a year now since October 7th, and there's global outrage, not only in the Muslim world, but beyond the Muslim world in terms of the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Could we kind of see a regional uprising, similar to what we saw in the Arab Spring back in 2011, considering that the Gaza situation is now inflaming in emotions and tensions? Now you've got this opposition making some headway in Syria. Could we kind of see a regional movement once again?
We cannot exclude it altogether, but I do not think at this point in time there are any signs of that. So, but because of the volatility that we have in so many countries in the Middle East, the situation may change overnight. And we know from our experience from what happened in 2011 with the Arab Spring, how suddenly that can happen. And how suddenly the situation can become more volatile and then being exploited by many other sort of groups trying to use that for their own purposes. So the volatility itself and the tension that we have over a range of countries and in a wide region of the Middle East makes it altogether a very dangerous situation. But I have to add, I don't think any of the countries want that. And I think in most instances, they are desperately trying to find a political solution to all the conflicts that we have now in that part of the world. And it's in their best interest to do so.
So What role can Turkey play here, or for that matter, Qatar? Right? You spoke earlier on about Russia and Iran and them being preoccupied with other
Yeah.
things. Is this then an opportune moment for example, Turkey to come in and say, right, we will play a kind of facilitator, mediator
Yeah.
role and try and broker some kind
Yeah.
of a settlement between the Assad regime
Yeah.
and the opposition forces?
Indeed, you're quite right on that assessment. In fact, there are already talks that the parties that should come together now in trying to limit the damage or to contain the damage and to try and find a political solution are indeed Turkey and Qatar and Russia, and of course the Assad regime, and that again brings into question whether the Assad regime is prepared to face the opposition forces in a settlement situation and to try and find a settlement once and for all. Because if not, this conflict will change from a low intensity to a high intensity for many, many years to come. We've seen that with what happened between Israel and Gaza and the other Palestinian territories. So if there's no political settlement, this is the way it's going to be.
What do the opposition forces want? Is it purely that they want to see the downfall and the end of the Assad regime, or is there something else that could be offered to them that would make a peace agreement more realistic?
I think initially it was their aim to get rid of the Assad regime because of the highly unpopularity at the time. And I think those sentiments may still be there, but I don't think it can be executed realistically. It's not achievable, I think, given the situation in which the opposition movements are in. I don't think they have the power to do it. So I think they will settle for something less, maybe for the interim at least, and that is to have a say in the government and to be accommodated within the governmental structures of Syria.
Who is likely to be able to exert pressure and influence on the Assad regime to get them to the negotiating table and to get them to compromise?
I think Iran, Russia, and Turkey are in a good position to do that.
In terms of the regional dynamics, could there be now other forces that are looking at what's happening in Syria and maybe considering this as an opportunity for themselves? Things kind of went dormant in that whole region because prior to the COVID period, we had the whole ISIS phenomenon, then you had the opposition forces within Syria. Things have gone quiet on many, if not all of those fronts in that broader region, apart from the Palestinian issue. Could what's happening in Syria now give rise to opposition forces wanting a second bite of the cherry in other countries within the region?
Yeah, I think it's possible because we still have forces like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, whatever it is called these days, and several other rebel movements, even inside Syria. And there's the Kurdish problem, which is also not being settled. It's contained, but it's not settled. And some of the rebel forces inside Syria are Kurdish dominated, and that's why Turkey has a very strong interest in this because it still deals with the Kurdish problem regularly, and it's on its border. So this may be opportunity for others to exploit the situation. It's not something that we cannot exclude altogether.
We know South Africa on the Palestinian issue has been very vocal, taking Israel right to the ICJ. In the initial stages of this civil war in Syria, the then administration here in South Africa had a fairly vocal position on the matter. Now the dynamics are somewhat different. We've got a GNU, we've got a president who's trying to keep together a cabinet. What's your assessment of what South Africa is likely to say and likely to do? What role can South Africa play in terms of the Syrian situation?
Yeah, I don't think it can play a role because I don't see it having any sort of leverage in conflicts of that kind. Firstly, and secondly, it still has um, to proceed with the current sort of actions against Israel in the ICJ, um, and it has a very strong position as far as the Gaza conflict is concerned. It doesn't have the same kind of intention with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. So my assessment is taking the whole sort of developments since the Ukraine war into account, and how South Africa voted in the General Assembly on condemnatory resolutions against Russia. So by abstaining all the time, I think in this conflict that we now have building up in Syria, it may have a very, very sort of low-key response saying that the party should settle their differences by political means and in a peaceful way, like it has done in the case of the Russian-Ukraine conflict.
In terms of the UN, have they made any comments thus far? Have they given any indication in terms of what they assess the situation to be?
I haven't seen anything. It may be the case, but I haven't seen anything, and I think the UN is probably also watching how this is going to develop, and whether other forces will intervene and then probably issue a statement.
We know that in the initial days, and I want to talk about the humanitarian perspective, right, moving away from the political issue. In the initial days, there was a lot of media focus internationally in terms of the plight of the Syrian refugees, refugee camps, Syrian refugees trying to, cross waters in very dangerous ways and get across to other countries, now trying to seek better prospects and better livelihood. That picture that is still etched in the minds of many people of the body of that young boy that washed up on shore after he fell overboard. What's the humanitarian situation like, considering that there hasn't been that much media focus in the last couple of years since things went a bit quiet in terms of the hostilities?
It is still a deep crisis, the humanitarian situation. Just to give some figures, I mean, there were 6 million refugees. And I do not know, I can't remember the exact figure of internally displaced persons. 500,000 Syrians killed. So the sort of legacy of that situation is still with us and inside Syria and inside neighboring countries, because many of the refugees have not returned. Only a small number. I think I'm now sort of taking a guess. I think it was the figure that I saw was about 70,000 that has returned. So large numbers still remain as refugees elsewhere and need to be cared for. So if this situation is going to get to the same level or at a higher level of intensity as it is now, we may see a repeat or an increase in the situation, with more people being replaced internally or displaced internally, and with another sort of stream of refugees trying to flee those areas. So I think, especially from the United Nations point of view, and his refugee agency is watching this very closely, because on top of what we had and still have, this could become far more serious than it is at the moment.
Finally, then, Prof, Syria is an oil-producing country. How significant a player, a global player, are they when it comes to the production of oil? And has that been compromised because of this 14-year hostilities?
Yeah, I don't think it is in the same position it was before the conflict started in 2011, but still, it has adequate resources still available, and the capacity and the ability to produce oil. But I think that there are other oil-producing countries in a far better position at this point in time in terms of being in a position to supply the demand. But still, it plays a factor, and it's a geopolitical factor. The fact that it is an oil-producing country, and other countries like America and maybe lots other Russia, and also in the immediate vicinity, will of course have that as an interest, or may have that as an interest, that capacity is not destroyed or is in some form still available.
Professor Hennie Strydom, thank you so much for your time and for chatting to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and all the best to you.
You too. Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Hennie Strydom, giving us a comprehensive picture of the situation in Syria, what happened 14 years ago, what's been happening the last couple of years. There's been a bit of a lull, if you want to call it that, in terms of the hostilities between the opposition parties or the opposition forces and the Assad regime, but not in terms of the humanitarian crises. That continued. And I suppose the Syrian refugees kind of suffered when international focus moved towards Gaza, and understandably so. The situation was indeed very dire in Gaza. Aleppo has been taken. It's still somewhat unclear as to how they were able to do so quickly, and whether they just seized an opportunity and they saw it and they took it. Was it a once-off? Will they be able to do this again? To what extent is Damascus vulnerable? There's a lot of speculation about these things, but we're trying to unpack that and get the professor's view as an academic on that particular issue. The dynamics have changed for the Assad regime because their support from Russia, from Iran, from Hezbollah won't be the same. They occupied in their own issues. What is the Trump regime likely to say come January when he takes office? Could this impact on the broader situation in the region and on the Palestinian issue? All of this remains to be seen. But the people on the ground continue to suffer. And that's where we should never forget to continue to include them in our du'as and include them in our supplications, and make dua to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala eases the plight of those who are suffering wherever they may be in the world. Until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.